Hello everyone, and welcome to part 2 of our textbook in Gender and Philosophy. The section of this chapter is called What is Sexism? And we're going to take a look at the writings from Kate Millett, Ann Cudd and Leslie Jones, Susan Fry, Susan Bartley, and Marion Young. So starting off with Kate Millett, who was an American feminist activist, writer, filmmaker, teacher, and human rights advocate. This particular reading is from her book Sexual Politics, which actually helped to fuel the second wave of feminism in the United States. Chapter 2 of this textbook demonstrates that sex is a status category with political implications, right? So we will later address the issue of whether or not sex is tied specifically to biology, but the idea is that regardless of whether or not sex is tied to biological functions, the category itself functions to grant social status with significant political implications that she will go into great detail to discuss. So by politics here, she is talking about the power structure relationships, right, in general, not just government politics, but general power structures between groups where typically, right, one group controls another. And of course, the political system or power structure that we are existing in is one of patriarchy, where, again, as a generalization, men typically, but primarily white, able-bodied, heteronormative men, right, control women, and women have not only no recourse, right, which she will talk about and we'll discuss examples of, but also great incentives to not fight against that patriarchal structure and to help maintain the status quo. So I have a little activity here for you if you'd like to practice sort of diving into these readings on your own, right? So here there are 8 different areas of sexism which Millett is going to go through. So if you'd like, you can follow these steps to practice before checking your own answers against the summaries that I've provided. So let's start off with the ideological component or dimension of sexism, right? This has to do with the use of that power structure, not just in general life, but also, again, in government structures, to uphold, either through the consent of their people or violence, the power which they currently hold, right? So the idea is that they have an existing power and they will either use popular opinion or physical violence, typically both, right, especially in the component of patriarchy, but they will use those forces to maintain their power. So Millett looks at the way that consent, right, in this case, is obtained through the socialization of both sexes, right, so again, talking about the binary here, with regard to 3 primary elements: temperament, roles, and status. So what do we mean by temperament? Well, the idea here is that human beings have been socialized, right, to align themselves characteristically with one of the 2 binaries in the traditional sex categories, right? Either they're socialized, right, raised, and put pressure on to conform to masculinity, or they're raised and pressured to conform to what we might traditionally understand as femininity. But the important point here is that traditional notions of masculinity and femininity, which we'll be exploring more in detail later throughout the quarter, both function to support male dominance, right? So it's not that traditional femininity is opposite from masculinity in the sense that it strives for its own power over men, right? It's seen as opposite purely in its characteristics, which when, as we saw with Simone de Beauvoir, when we associate masculinity with the norm, right, what is typical, what is positive, what happens with its opposing force of femininity is that it is maintained as weakness, right, lesser than, inferior to. And so when we are stereotyped in our temperament, in our behaviors, in our conceptions of ourself, in our characteristics, to one of these 2 binaries of sex, the idea then is that those characteristics should correspond to quote-unquote traditional sex or gender roles, right? So the idea is that if you are feminine, you would fit most neatly into a feminine role in society, which I'm sure we all know has historically and still today, right, there are groups that are advocating for the notion that women's only place is in the home, right? not as individual selves, but as mothers and spouses, right? And so the idea is that we've constructed not just legal roles that men and women have been placed in throughout history, which she'll talk about, but that these are actually very elaborate codes of conduct which we can ascribe to each sex in terms of how they should speak, how they should dress, how they should move about in a certain space, how they should have a certain attitude towards certain things,